The selection for characters in the Smash series is a fascinating subject. Reacting to new reveals, speculating fighters, there's almost a whole industry just talking about this single subject. But something that's interesting to look back on are characters that almost made it into Smash. Characters that might have been briefly considered or scrapped early on, or actually had work done before being cut fairly late. Every Smash game has their fair share of characters that have been cut, and so in this video, that's what I want to talk about. So buckle up, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and let's dive into scrap characters across all of Smash's history, starting with Super Smash Bros. On the Nintendo 64. Being the first Smash game, Smash 64 was pretty bare bones, so it should be no surprise that many ideas were left on the chopping block. Various modes, abilities, and indeed characters were considered for the final game, but for one reason or another were ultimately scrapped. For example, the original idea was for all of Team Star Fox to encompass a single Star Fox character, with Fox being the main character, but Falco, Slippy, and Peppy all serving as different alternate costumes. This was revealed in a Q&A segment on the Smash 64 website. The idea was cut after some discussion, keeping Fox as the full character with some simple palette swaps. Marth was also a character that was considered for the game but was ultimately scrapped. This was revealed a considerable amount of time after Smash 64's release, over 15 years later, during an interview with Sakurai for Fire Emblem's 25th anniversary. Sakurai stated that he wanted to include Marth originally in Smash 64, but the development of the game was very tight, and some features that ended up in the game were just barely finished. So it seems like it was simply a matter of development time, and the 4 secret characters that we ended up getting were included because they were able to reuse assets from other characters. Marth, of course, would have been a totally unique character, basically starting from the ground up. But when asked why Marth, Sakurai said it was to serve as more variation for sword-wielding characters. You had Link, who was someone that used the sword in a more brute force kind of way, on top of using all of his different items. So having someone like Marth, who was trained in the blade and would be far more technical with the sword, it kind of struck a nice balance. And those were just the characters that were scrapped conceptually, with no work done on them. There were, however, characters that had work done, and that were likely in a somewhat playable state that have never seen the light of day. And those characters were King Bowser and King Dedede. In a reader response submission on the Smash 64 website, a fan asked if Bowser and Dedede were super secret characters you could get in the game, in classic playground rumor fashion. Sakurai denied these claims, but he said that at one point they were planned for the game and were partially complete at one point in time. Now what that actually means is basically speculation, but it seems that at some point they were intended for the game. Another piece of evidence is thrown into this thanks to an interview with Nintendo Power, where Shigeru Miyamoto states that Bowser would be in Smash, which is implying that on the internal end they actually intended for him to be in the game. The final character who was planned for Smash 64 is none other than Mewtwo. The Smash 64 website ran a poll that was titled If There Was a Smash 2, which allowed fans to vote for characters they'd want to see in Smash. Kind of the first ever Smash ballot, except you were unlikely to know about it if you weren't in Japan. The results were posted with quite a small number of votes actually, and Mewtwo tied with James Bond for the 6th most wanted character. The bottom of this page actually has a couple footnotes, and one of the statements is that Bowser, King Dedede, and Mewtwo were all actually planned for Smash 64, but were cut for one reason or another. This doesn't really give us a ton of information, and we're not clear how deep into development Mewtwo got, or if any development was done. This could have easily been a case of being scrapped in the planning stages, but the information we have is just too vague. Next, we'll move on to Super Smash Bros. Melee, which had an incredibly quick turnaround, dropping just 2 years after Smash 64's release. This game was essentially meant to take the solid foundation Smash 64 laid and make every aspect of the game bigger and better, and the character roster was no exception, going from 12 in 64 to 26 total characters in Melee. Quite a few characters didn't make the cut for Melee, with some being immediately dismissed and others being heavy contenders that just ended up not working out. A couple that were very briefly considered were Mach Rider, Takamaru, and Ayumi Tachibana. For Mach Rider and Takamaru, it's really unclear how serious their consideration was. Both instances where they were mentioned for Melee, they seemed to almost be jokes. In a reader response on the Smash 64 website, Sakurai said he'd personally like to see Mach Rider in a Smash 2 because his name, Mach, is great. For Takamaru, again on the Smash website, Sakurai said, "What's more likely, a new entry in the mysterious Murasame Castle series, or Takamaru being playable in Smash 2. Well, both are pretty unlikely. Dang. So whether or not these were serious considerations, it's unlikely that they got any further than a brainstorming session. Ayumi Tachibana, however, seemed to be a far more serious contender. Sakurai is a fan of Famicom Detective Club, Ayumi's game series, and he stated that he was considering a rep from this series for Melee. But the reason we didn't get one is purely a popularity thing, and Sakurai knew that she wouldn't work overseas, as the series at the time hadn't been released outside of Japan, so that's why she is simply relegated to a trophy. Lucas from Mother 3 was also originally planned to appear in the game, completely replacing Ness as the representative for the Mother series. At the time, the latest entry in the Mother series was being developed for the Nintendo 64 disk drive, but with the GameCube right around the corner and a few years of development still needed on the new Mother game, the game was ultimately scrapped, before being revived for the Game Boy Advance later on. Had the game not been scrapped, Lucas would have replaced Ness as a way to rep the latest in the Mother series, but Ness ultimately reprised his spot in the character roster. A handful of third parties were also seriously considered, both as a result of Smash's popularity, but also from the Smash 2 poll on the 64 website. As we know, none of these ended up coming to fruition, but it's interesting to talk about nonetheless. Two rare characters ended up cracking the top 10 for Smash 2's poll: James Bond from GoldenEye 007 and Banjo-Kazooie. At the time, it seems Nintendo was apprehensive about using a rare property outright, which is why both of these were rejected. James Bond was actually given even more reasoning in a reader response. Sakurai said that showing realistic guns, using an actor's likeness, getting movie rights because GoldenEye was a licensed game, and being Rare's property were all major hurdles for James Bond, all of which does make sense in a weird Nintendo logic kind of way. Solid Snake was another character that had a very close brush with joining Melee. Sakurai revealed in an interview at Brawl's release that Metal Gear series director Hideo Kojima actually called him up and practically begged to have Snake put into Melee. But by the time this took place, development was incredibly far along for Melee, and including another character wasn't realistic. Plus, he figured they'd be making another Smash game afterwards, so he basically just said, "Just ask me again next time, LOL." The same thing apparently happened for Sonic as well, with the then head of Sonic Team, Yuji Naka, asking for Sonic to be put in. But again, it was too late in development, making it impractical without delays, so it was simply no dice. Of course, both Snake and Sonic would be the bombshell third-party additions for Smash later in Brawl, so all hope wasn't lost. When Sakurai started development on Melee, he knew that he wanted a character that specifically represented the Famicom era of Nintendo. He revealed on the Japanese Melee website that there were a few contenders for this spot, but each had their downsides that made them impossible. First was a fighter from Balloon Fight, but once his balloons are popped, it doesn't really seem possible for him to be able to fight. The second was Urban Champion, but that game is pretty limited in its movement options, honestly, so a translation to Smash wouldn't offer very much. Then was a character from Clu Clu Land, but being a puzzle game, it doesn't exactly offer much inspiration for how they might fight. And lastly is a biker from Excite Bike. On top of also not having much of a way to fight, they would have had to create ramps for him to be able to jump, though Sakurai does note that that wouldn't have been too much of an issue. Overall, it didn't really seem like any of these had much of a chance, as they each had their own unique obstacles that probably could have turned out sloppy. So in the end, Ice Climbers were the ultimately selected Famicom character. And finally, for Melee is less of a scrapped character and more of a what-if character. On multiple fan messages on the Melee website, many people asked where Wario was, and Sakurai confessed that if he had had time to include just one more character to the roster, it would have been Wario. It's unsure if any development was done on Wario, or if that was just the character that was next on his list, but either way, we ended up seeing this gassy plumber debut as one of the earliest new characters in Brawl. And speaking of Brawl, it's time to talk about that game. Brawl had quite a few characters that never made it past the planning phase, but there were quite a few serious suggestions that never ultimately came to be. The most famous of these is probably Geno. Geno was actually a personal wish for Sakurai, stating that he wanted Geno to be a playable character. He's got a gun for a hand, and Sakurai really thought he would fit well in Smash. There's never really been a public reason given, Geno just never really made the cut. During the planning phase for Pokemon Trainer, all 3 Kanto starters' full evolutions were considered to be the 3 swappable Pokemon, and then they considered all first stage starters, but ultimately they went in a different direction. Sakurai thought that covering all of the different stages of evolution, base Pokemon, Stage 1, and Final Evolution, made for a well-rounded representation of Pokemon. On top of this, each character filled a different archetype in the game. You have small but speedy, an all-rounder, and then a heavyweight. Crystal from Star Fox was also considered for Brawl, but time constraints combined with the amount of work needed kept her from being fully realized. In an interview, Sakurai stated that the work that they'd previously done on Fox and Falco didn't translate over to Crystal, so they'd essentially have to be starting from scratch. This is why they ultimately went with Wolf, because it would only take about 70% of the effort of a whole new character, because they could use Fox and Falco as a base. A few characters were also immediately dropped at the brainstorming stage. Villager, Pac-Man, and Mies were all famously rejected for Brawl before immediately being introduced in the very next Smash game. Both Villager and Mies weren't really thought to be appropriate in a fighting scenario, which is why they were rejected at the time. Sakurai was also concerned about bullying with regard to Mies, and he was additionally concerned that they would be boring to fight because they don't have much character. Shigeru Miyamoto personally asked Sakurai what he thought of Pac-Man as a guest for Brawl, and Sakurai said he immediately envisioned the pizza-like character, his old arcade sprite. We have to do a bit of guesswork here, but it's possible Sakurai was conflicted on how the design of such a character and moveset would be executed, which is why Pac-Man was ultimately rejected for Brawl. But of course, he finally debuted in Smash 4, and I'm sure it helps that Pac-Man's own company was helping with the development of the game so they could fully realize Pac-Man as a fighter. But by far the most infamous group of characters that were seemingly scrapped from Brawl is the group that came to be known by fans as the Forbidden Seven. All of these characters have some amount of leftover data inside of Brawl's game files. This leftover data varies quite a bit. Some had actual files in the game at one point, while others just have their names in the game data and nothing else. But it all implies that these 7 characters were, at some point, planned to appear in Brawl as playable characters. Roy has data for a unique victory fanfare, while Mewtwo has data for both a unique victory fanfare and a Wii Remote sound effect. Unfortunately, all of these files are empty, so we can't get a listen to what these would have been. Dixie Kong is another character that likely had more work than just a name file done at some point. Sakurai revealed in a Famitsu interview that the original plan was for Diddy Kong and Dixie Kong to be a tag team, based on their mechanic in Donkey Kong Country 2, which was notably Dixie Kong's debut game. They would have been able to alternate positions mid-match, but unfortunately they posed a programming hurdle, and it was ultimately decided that Diddy Kong would simply be a solo fighter, with Dixie being completely scrapped. The remaining 4 have the least information made publicly available, as they exist only by file name: Dr. Mario, Toon Zelda, Toon Sheik, and Plusle and Minun. Dr. Mario is rather straightforward, returning from Melee, and he was simply passed over. Toon Zelda is also straightforward. Between Melee and Brawl, Wind Waker released, introducing a new style for the Zelda series. Young Link from Melee was ultimately turned into Toon Link for Brawl onward, and Wind Waker also featured a Toon Zelda, so it's likely that the Smash team at some point wanted to include this version of Zelda as well. Toon Sheik trips people up a bit because there is no canon Toon Sheik in the Wind Waker line. One theory is that this was the file name for Tetra, the character that is later revealed to be a reincarnation of Zelda. But if this were the case, then surely they would have named the file Tetra, not Sheik. It's additionally possible that they simply would have invented a Toon Sheik to match Toon Zelda, but because all we have are file names, we can never really know for sure. Finally, we have a file name of pra_my. This one is up for debate, though the general consensus is that this could have potentially been another 2-in-1 character of Plusle and Minun, with their names perhaps lining up with this abbreviation. There are also debates as to whether this could be a translation for the Mies, or simply an entry for the random button, as both of these could also potentially fit. However, these 7 characters seem to have made it the furthest before getting scrapped, leaving fans to wonder what could have been. It's now time to move on to Smash for 3DS and Wii U. This game had quite a few characters that were considered but ultimately scrapped. However, unlike previous games, these were all during the planning phase. For both Smash 4 and Ultimate, the Smash team finalized their project proposal and then never deviated from it, whereas with previous games they would potentially include last-minute characters or changes. Interestingly, Heihachi was a character that was considered for Smash 4, but it was ultimately decided that his moveset would be too difficult to implement. This information is kind of bizarre considering we now have Kazuya from Tekken, but Sakurai clarified that Kazuya's Devil Gene is what gave him an edge over Heihachi. Tekken characters are significantly slower and less mobile than Smash characters, which would have made Heihachi either a really poorly balanced character in Smash, or not at all like his source material. But the devil gene that Kazuya has gave the Smash team a creative outlet for other parts of his moveset, such as the double jump or special moves, and they couldn't have done this with Heihachi as he doesn't have the devil gene. But at least we know at some point Heihachi was considered for Smash. Takamaru, like in Melee, was again considered to be a playable character, but he was passed on again simply because he wouldn't be popular enough. This time though, the team compromised and made him an assist trophy instead. Chrom was also considered as a character and apparently had a moveset concept made up by Sakurai, but it essentially boiled down to being a mix of Marth and Ike's movesets, so he was passed over as a unique character, of course debuting in Ultimate as an Echo Fighter later. Speaking of Echo Fighters, Alf was originally meant to be a clone character in Smash 4. Not much is known on what their differences would have been, but it obviously didn't happen as Alf became the second half of Olimar's 8 costumes in Smash 4. Ice Climbers were also intended to return, as they had in Brawl. The only struggle was that Smash 4 was being developed for both the 3DS and the Wii U, and Sakurai was hellbent on making sure the rosters for both versions of the game were identical. He didn't want you to have to play one version or the other just to play as a specific character, which meant that the full roster needed to function on both sets of hardware, and unfortunately the Ice Climbers just did not. While they ran fine on the Wii U version of the game, the 3DS just simply wasn't powerful enough, with Sakurai saying he couldn't get them to work no matter what he tried, so he just had to give up. Finally is a rather weird character that even to this day we're not really sure about, and that was a rep from the Rhythm Heaven series. In Smash 4's files, there's a series emblem for Rhythm Heaven, suggesting that a character from this series was going to appear in the game. The famous Gamatsu leaker stated that this was going to be the Chorus Kids in his leaks, which notably ended up being nearly entirely correct. So between the leak and the emblem, there is at least some evidence to encourage the fact that Chorus Kids were at one point considered playable. And now for Smash Ultimate. There isn't a ton of scrapped character information out there, either for base roster or DLC, but we do know about a couple. When it was decided that Castlevania would have a rep in Smash, it was momentarily considered to make the fighter Alucard. In a Famitsu interview, Sakurai said that it was a struggle to pick a fighter from this series because the protagonists changed so often, but he thought it was best to pick from characters that are linked to the Belmont family, which is why we got both Simon and Richter. The timing of the base roster's finalized plan meant that it was unfortunate timing for a couple of then upcoming Nintendo titles. ARMS and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 were both still in development and the timing just didn't work out, and because they wanted to stick to their finalized project plan, it simply wasn't doable. Of course, we now know that they took those ideas and were able to execute them as DLC later on, but for the base roster, they were ultimately scrapped. As with most new entries for Smash, a fighter is typically earmarked for the Pokemon series. Because there are so many to choose from each new generation, they basically just say, let's decide on that later once we see the new designs. This happened for Pokemon Sun and Moon's new Pokemon, and Decidueye was actually in the running for the Gen 7 rep, likely because a Final Evolution Grass starter was the only one still missing. But in the end, Incineroar's wrestler theme was just too cool, so Decidueye, he got the sack. For the DLC, a slime was considered to be the full fighter in the event that Sakurai's request for Hero was denied, so it seems that Sakurai actually had some idea of how to make slime work as a full character. For the ARMS fighter, Sakurai also considered Ninjara to be DLC number 6 rather than Min Min, but the ARMS series director personally asked for Min Min to be the fighter, so that seemed to tip the scales in her favor. And finally, it seems that Rex was considered to be the DLC fighter for Xenoblade 2 initially. He would apparently fight alongside Pyra, and the player would control both at once. However, this proved to have its challenges to create, and on top of that would push the system to its limits, so it was ultimately decided to have Pyra and Mithra be the fighters themselves, and simply swap back and forth between each other like Zelda and Sheik. And that is going to do it. Those are all of the scrapped characters that we currently know about for every single Super Smash Bros. Game. There are quite a few scrap characters on the list, and it's honestly a shame that we haven't seen some of them. Like Marth in Smash 64 or James Bond in Melee, those would have been so sick to actually see in the final game. So naturally, I would love to know which scrapped character you would have loved to see actually make it to be a full fighter down in those comments below. Obviously, I would have loved to see Banjo-Kazooie make it in Melee, but I don't think beggars can be choosers at this point because he at least made it in Ultimate. So honestly, seeing Martin 64 and James Bond in Melee, and even see how Toon Zelda and Toon Chic would have worked, I think those would be my picks for if I, could go back in time and actually make them real. So I would love to know what you guys think, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button, and if you are brand new to the channel, then please make sure you subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace out, I hope you guys have an awesome day, and please remember to be good to one another.